Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and this is an editorial that's a little bit different than what I usually do. I've noticed some videos popping up recently regarding a new tabletop role-playing game called The Fate of Cthulhu, and specifically the rather controversial approach it takes. For those who may not have heard of what's going on, here's the briefest of brief summaries. Basically, in the opening pages of The Fate of Cthulhu, a page is devoted to addressing the fact that H.P. Lovecraft had certain prejudices. Although, as the book puts it, they refer to Lovecraft as a racist scumbag. It starts off saying that they don't condone the prejudices he had, but the further along it goes, the more it starts to veer into realms of, let's just say, overcompensating. Talking about making the game a safe place and then suddenly saying there are certain things that should not be addressed, that there are themes that should be avoided, there are topics which should not be broached, there should be inclusivity and all sorts of things emphasized. The basic term people would use these days to describe it would be Fate of Cthulhu is woke. That's the shorthand version of it. And there are plenty, and I mean plenty of videos and editorials out there which are picking this whole thing apart. You go onto the Twitter page of the company that made the game, they're also really digging in their heels in this regard, and it's a mess. The whole thing, just an utter mess. Also a popular topic among the people deconstructing Fate of Cthulhu's approach is to say that it's rather odd, don't you think, that the people behind this game are condemning H.P. Lovecraft and saying they despise him and his politics and they want nothing to do with him, but they have absolutely no problem taking all of his work and commandeering it for themselves to use and make money off of. That doesn't sound unscrupulous at all, does it? However, this video is not just about ripping apart Fate of Cthulhu. There are already enough think pieces on the internet doing that. I've seen plenty of them, and it occurred to me, of those pieces, no one is really providing an alternative to what Fate of Cthulhu is putting forward. And that's when it occurred to me that an alternative does exist, and I think it's worth sharing with all of you. This is the core rulebook for Trail of Cthulhu, written by Kenneth Hite and published by Peregrine Press. It is meant to be sort of a spiritual successor to the original Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, which implements the gumshoe system. Just a brief explanation of what that is. Both Trail and Call are story-based and mystery-based games. You're playing investigators trying to solve a mystery. But an issue that constantly cropped up with Call of Cthulhu was that sometimes investigators would leave a scene before they'd gathered all the clues, which meant they couldn't solve the mystery, which meant the campaign ground to a screeching halt. The gumshoe system ensures that that sort of thing doesn't happen. But that's not what this video is about. Rather, this is about how Trail of Cthulhu also addressed that more uncomfortable side of the Cthulhu mythos that all us fans have to deal with, but it did so in a very interesting way, a way I think that is much better than what Fate of Cthulhu put forward. And I'm going to share it with you in its entirety. The section of the book is A Desperate Decade. It's on page 172 if you have this book, and it's just a single page opposite of this picture. I'm going to read the whole thing to you in its entirety before I break it down. And I think it is important that you hear the whole thing, so here we go. This section in particular is called The Crawling Order Totalitarianism, opens with a quote from The Shadow over Innsmouth. No trials or even definite charges were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular gaols of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. And now on to the original section of the page. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about the 1930s is this. Virtually every intellectual and political observer of the time believed at one point or another that the future was going to be written by Hitler or by Stalin, and they chose up sides accordingly. Lovecraft began as a fan of Hitler and converted late in life to supporting a sort of dirigist, collectivist technocracy. His description of the Yithian civilization as a kind of fascistic socialism is not intended horrifically. The rise of Cthulhu in the secret places of the world mirrors the rise of totalitarianism, not merely in overseas labor camps from Dachau or Vorkuta, but in the salons and soirees of New York and London. This provides Trail of Cthulhu games not merely an endless supply of potential bad guys, but a potentially powerful thematic element as well. But using totalitarianism for either purpose runs a few risks, and implies a few choices. The first possible direction is the one taken by F. Paul Wilson's novel The Keep, in which a rabbi and an SS commandant must ally to battle an inhuman monster. In this approach, the horror of the mythos is such that it overwhelms all human politics, and one can assume that right-thinking agents of the NKVD and the Gestapo would agree. This raises the unsettling possibility that the actual best, most workable solution to the interpenetration of humanity by Cthulhuoid horror is the one followed in the shadow over Innsmouth, and one that anti-mythos investigators in Berlin, Moscow, Rome, Tokyo, or Madrid would reflexively follow. Concentration camps, secret prisons, and one presumes mass graves somewhere desolate. Forcing players to make, or even accede knowingly to, such choices should be done deliberately, if at all. Of course, this knowledge alone, that their governments have decided to use such tactics, may be enough to keep some player groups conveniently reluctant to call in the FBI or MI5. Another method of seeding this dramatically useful distrust is to imply that at least some elements in some human governments are attempting to harness the mythos for themselves. This can be a sort of Arkham Project scenario, in which the bureaucrats don't actually know or care what they unleash, or an implication of spreading viral cultism as interrogators discover just what kind of powers their prisoners had access to. This approach is reinforced if the Keeper chooses to go the Indiana Jones direction, in which evil Nazis or commies are hunting the living idol Sjognarfallen, or searching for the ruins of Comorium in the Greenland ice sheet, and the bold investigators must beat them to it and stop them. After all, why would Hitler's goons be looking for the Necronomicon if not to use its powers to fuel the Blitzkrieg? This makes both narrative sense. If the powers of the mythos exist, surely people as bent as the Nazis would be looking into it, and dramatic sense. Stalin is evil and dangerous, Yog-Sothoth is evil and dangerous, bingo. But it runs the risk of sliding into Nyarlathotep invented the Nazis, or worse yet, Nyarlathotep magicked the Nazis into being so evil. This trivializes the decades' human history of genocide and oppression, turns real living atrocities into pulp supervillainy, and lets us all off the hook. Even less forgivably, it also makes the story boring and predictable. All the anti-fascists must be anti-Cthulhu too. Keep in mind that in real history, most of the anti-fascists were devoted servants of an ideology every bit as inhuman and murderous, and even the good guys got into bed with Hitler and Stalin when it suited them. If you're going to mix the mythos and politics, try to at least occasionally look at the story from the perspective of cults and gods to whom the entire human race are insects, and to whom Gandhi and Tojo are both indistinguishable mayflies, or potential tools. Now, pause the video if you need to really let all of that sink in. Actually, while I'm at it, I just realized I mispronounced. It's not Peregrine Press, it's Pelgrane Press. So, anyway, point is, this book right here understands what the people behind Fate of Cthulhu do not. In the opening pages of Fate of Cthulhu, the mindset is that Lovecraft and all the people who thought like him were backwards and horrible, and we want nothing to do with them. They are all bad. We are not bad. We are the good guys, so we are opposing all of it, and that's how you should view the Cthulhu mythos. Which really misses the point. As Trail of Cthulhu points out, basically, the 1930s weren't that simple. Heck, H.P. Lovecraft himself wasn't that simple. Was H.P. Lovecraft a bigoted individual? Absolutely. However, that didn't necessarily prevent certain contradictions from cropping up in his life. He was outspokenly anti-Semitic, for example, yet the woman he was in the longest monogamous relationship with was Jewish. So wrap your head around that one. He knew she was Jewish too, and he always got kind of upset whenever people brought that up, according to what most eyewitness testimonies say. But he still dated her, he was still in love with her, even if it didn't really work out in the end. So clearly that's not the same thing as just writing him off as a total irredeemable racist scumbag. And as Trail of Cthulhu also points out, history's two most horrible genocidal maniacs, Hitler and Stalin, were both at one point or another considered visionaries who would shape the future. Never forget, Hitler was Time magazine's Man of the Year, proudly displayed on the cover. And it's that level of complexity that Trail of Cthulhu actually encourages the players and the game masters to actually embrace and play around with. It's not saying what you shouldn't do like Fate of Cthulhu does. It's saying you can do this, we advise that you do it in a particular way. You don't want to be disrespectful. None of this, the Nazis were just tools of Nyarlathotep sort of thing. But you also don't want to just outright avoid it. A 1930s setting, which is where the game takes place, without addressing things like organized crime or the rise of totalitarianism or things like that, is a very sanitized way to look at things. And it closes off a lot of storytelling possibilities. Role-playing games exist so that people can escape and become other people. It's kind of like this weird mixture of gameplay and acting, where you become a different person. And maybe you're doing that to fulfill a fantasy, or you're doing it to explore certain other things. Have you ever wondered, what would I do if I were in this scenario? A role-playing game allows you to explore that idea. Now obviously, it's a game, it's supposed to be fun, so if a line should be drawn anywhere, it should be at a point where things stop being fun, where a player or the game master is doing something not because it's beneficial to the story, but because they know it's going to irritate whoever is participating. That's not okay. But that shouldn't necessarily involve removing certain things. I mean, that last line on that page, where they say, if you're gonna incorporate politics into a Trail of Cthulhu game, you should at least try to occasionally look at it from the perspective of these massive godlike beings who make no distinction between a good person and a bad person. They are equally disposable or equally useful for manipulation. That's a line that I'm sure some people will hear and get instantly triggered by. But that's the point of the mythos. The point of the mythos is that no matter who you are on Earth, ultimately in the grand scheme of things, you are as subject to an uncaring universe as ever. Point of the mythos, clearly. Whether or not that's the point of the actual universe, whole different can of worms that I don't want to open up here. But the point of the Cthulhu mythos is that sort of cosmic horror. That idea of an indifferent universe that doesn't care if you've been good or bad. And personally, I would think that if you're going to participate in a Cthulhu mythos game, or a cosmic horror game in general, that implies a certain understanding that you know this in advance, and you're okay with exploring those kind of themes within the confines of the game. So, why put limits on that aspect of it? In fact, why incorporate politics into it and use it to try and push some sort of social agenda when Yog-Sothoth wouldn't care less about those agendas if he actually existed? And of course, that's not to say you shouldn't incorporate politics at all into these sort of games. The book doesn't say that. What it says is that you gotta do it in a certain way. It's got to be in service of the story. It's got to be appropriate. It's got to fit with the theme that's being pushed. Not necessarily an agenda, but a theme. And I see no problem with that line of thinking at all. I think that is the way that any sort of Lovecraftian game should be seen. That's just me. I know for a fact that there are quite a few other Lovecraft fans out there who also think this. But yeah, that's why I wanted to bring this up. I wanted to bring it up because people are tearing down Fate of Cthulhu for missing the point, but I also wanted to show that Trail of Cthulhu doesn't miss the point. Trail of Cthulhu gets it. Trail of Cthulhu knows what these sort of games are supposed to be. And I think it's important that we keep those examples in mind as well. So, there you have it. Trail of Cthulhu understands what Fate of Cthulhu does not. At least as far as I can tell, it does. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.